welcome to the Kim Iversen Show. Thank you guys so much for being here. So tonight we're going to hit on a subject many of you have requested, whether or not viruses exist. Now, I personally don't have an opinion either way on this. I was raised to believe viruses exist, so I'm inclined to think viruses exist by default. But now, especially since the pandemic, I've been highly skeptical of any claim that's been made, and so I'm open to the possibility that they don't. Well, tonight's guest is a medical doctor and a researcher and well-known advocate of alternative medicine who asserts they don't exist. Dr. Thomas Cowan is the author of The Contagion Myth, as well as other books. Dr. Cowan had a general medical practice for many decades in San Francisco, New Hampshire, and upstate New York. He actively lectures and interviews and shares information via his website, drtomcowan.com, where he also offers many of the products he used personally and in his practice. So he's going to make the case tonight. Viruses don't actually exist. I'm looking really forward to this conversation and to potentially be convinced. But first, here is a really cool device that I want to tell you about. It's called Lumen. And if you've ever wondered how to get real-time insights into your metabolism, this device will do just that. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. This revolutionary device measures your metabolism. All you have to do is breathe into it, and with the app, it tells you if you're burning fat or carbs. Plus, it offers a personalized guidance for your nutrition, workouts, sleep, and even stress management. It's simple. All you do is just breathe into your Lumen device first thing in the morning, and you'll instantly know if you're burning fat or carbs, which is pretty cool. Lumen then provides a customized nutrition plan for the day based on your measurements. You can also check in before and after workouts and meals to get real-time insights and tips on maintaining peak health. Your metabolism is the engine of your body, turning food into fuel. Optimal metabolic health translates to easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and enhanced sleep. Lumen gives you actionable recommendations to boost your metabolic health. It can also track hormonal changes, such as your cycle or menopause, and adjust its advice to help maintain your energy and curb cravings. It's really cool. All you got to do is visit lumen.me/Iversen to get 15% off your Lumen. That's LUMEN.me/Iversen for 15% off. Dr. Tom Cowan, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Kim. Good to meet you.
So I've had many people ask about this and wanting me to do a show on this. So here we are finally getting to this. And it is about viruses and the existence of viruses. Many people have written me throughout the years since COVID started saying, Kim, they usually say one of two things. One of them is they've never been able to isolate the COVID virus. There is no SARS-CoV-2 virus. It's made up. Others will write and say there are no viruses in general. Which camp are you in?
Well, like I say, you can't prove a negative. You can't say unicorns don't exist, right? You can say nobody has been able to demonstrate that unicorns exist.
Okay.
And so that nobody clearly has been able to demonstrate any virus, smallpox, polio, SARS-CoV-2, herpes actually exists. HIV, I could name 50 of them.
So you're saying all of these illnesses that we're getting, these ailments or whatever you want to call them, they're not caused by viruses. That a virus is, well, when did the concept of virus, I mean, I'm super ignorant on this. When did the concept of virus even come into kind of like in science, in medicine?
Yeah, I think the best way to explain this to your audience, who maybe particularly the ones who don't know much about it, is there's first, I think it would really help to go through two principles of science, logic, and rational thinking.
Okay.
Because by doing this first, we set the stage for understanding this issue about viruses. So if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
So the first one is the essence of science, called the null hypothesis, is somebody makes a claim, like such and such exists. And then the essence of science is the attempt to falsify the claim. If the claim can't be falsified, it's a belief system. And if it's the claim is falsified, then that story is over.
Okay.
Now, you don't need to have an alternative explanation for whatever it is you're talking about. That has nothing to do with science. Now, let me give you an example so that you understand this and everybody listening. Let's say you're an 18-year-old Asian-looking fellow. Your parents are Caucasian. And then one day you look in their closet and you find out adoption papers, and they never told you were adopted. So you go through, you find out, you say it's all real. You go to your parents and say, you never told me I was adopted. Is it true? And because I've never seen pictures of mom pregnant. Yes, it's true. We were waiting to tell you. We just didn't get around to it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then you go to your best friend and you say, wow, I just found out today I was adopted. And he says to you, so who's your real parents? And you say, I don't know. I just found out. They said it was in China, it was an orphanage. I may never find out. And he says, until you tell me who your real parents are, I don't believe you were adopted.
Okay. Okay.
Right? That's ridiculous.
Right.
So if somebody says, so I've heard this more than 1,000 times. I say there's no evidence that there's a chickenpox virus. So people say, so what causes chickenpox? Well, first, that's who are your real parents? That's not the issue. The issue is there's a claim, there's a specific illness called chickenpox, and there's a specific entity, a physical entity called a virus, and that's the cause of this illness. That's what we're going to investigate. Now, at the end of that, once we all agree there's no such thing as a virus, we can speculate about what maybe this phenomena called chickenpox is.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of that. But it has no relation to whether there's a virus or not, whether I'm right about that.
Right. But I think that, and I understand that, and the adoption illustration is a good one, except that I do think people would want to know, well, then what causes this? I mean, it's...
Of course they want to know.
Right, right. But I understand that that's separate from the claim.
It's separate. And
yes.
If you don't keep that straight, you will never understand this issue.
Uh-huh. So what's gone on, again, can you tell us when viruses were, when did they say, oh, it's a virus, like a virus causes this? Because we know about bacteria causes this. At what point in science did they say, oh, a virus causes this?
Right. So bacteria don't cause illness either, by the way, but that's a different story.
Okay.
So, but I want to say another principle here, just because this helps people understand. If you are investigating an issue and you look for the thing that determines the truth or falsity of that claim, and once you have that, then you do that experiment, and then the story is over.
Uh-huh.
Let me give you an example. You got 3 dots on a piece of paper, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I ask you the question, are these dots in a straight line? So some people would say, well, let's ask the head of the Department of Straight Lineology.
Okay.
Or let's see what the consensus of people think. But I think, and science thinks, you need a ruler. And you do the experiment. Turns out they're not on a straight line. End of story. And we're done with that issue.
Right.
Now, let me get into so back in the late 1800s, there were people who were getting sick, just like always. And a bunch of people, and this wasn't new, but they said, well, we think that there are unseen entities that are making people sick, right? Because the first way we know stuff is through observation.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you broke your leg. Why did you break your leg? You fell off a horse, right? So that's something that we all experience. So we saw people getting sick, polio, supposedly smallpox, etc. And nobody saw anything, nobody smelled anything, nobody heard anything. And so a bunch of guys, particularly Pasteur and Robert Koch, said, these are caused by these organisms that we can see under the microscope called bacteria,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So then they did the experiment, like measuring with a ruler. So they took so then the step to figure out whether the bacteria caused the disease. Now, when I'm about to say this, you should think whether you agree this is right or not. So let's say two things. One, you could take a big vat of things with bacteria that you can see under a microscope, and it's got arsenic in it, and it's got lead, and it's got, DDT. They didn't have DDT then. And you feed that to an animal and see if they get sick. That would be one way. Or you could just have the bacteria, feed those to an animal or spray them on and see if that made them sick. Now, I would say that the first way won't tell you anything except something in there made the animal sick.
Yeah.
The second way, which is you isolate the thing you're looking for, right? And you see if that makes the animal sick. So they did that, and no animals got sick, no bacteria. And if anybody disagrees with that, they're going to have to show me a study in the last 150 years where an isolated, purified bacteria made one animal or person sick, because I can tell you it doesn't exist.
Really?
Now,
okay.
If you disagree, send me the study, because we have 20 people looking and we can't find that study.
Okay.
Now, so then they had disease. So they said, so illness is caused by germs. We can't see them, but we know that's the case, right? Because we did it with bacteria, even though it turns out they didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So then they had illnesses like polio, where they couldn't find a bacteria. No bacteria in the spine. There was no bacteria they could test. So they said, as a hypothesis, right, a guess, there's something smaller than a bacteria that's causing this illness called polio. And they called that a virus. They didn't see a virus. They didn't smell a virus. They didn't taste a virus. They just said that was a hypothesis. Now, there's nothing wrong with hypothesis, right? But then you have to prove it.
Right.
So they took the ground up spinal cord of children with polio and they exposed animals to it. None of them got sick. So then finally, around 1908, they proved that polio is a transmissible disease caused by something smaller than a virus. This is how the virus story got started.
Okay.
So they took a child who died of polio. They had a diseased spine. They ground it up in a blender, put it through a filter that got the bacteria out, right? So they have everything that was in the spine, God knows what, proteins, enzymes, toxins, and maybe a virus in the fluid, right? You with me?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, 10 cc's, injected it into two monkeys' brains, right into their brain. One monkey died, the other one got paralyzed. That proved that polio was caused by a virus. They didn't inject, they didn't see a virus, they didn't smell a virus, they didn't isolate a virus and only inject that. They didn't inject 10 cc's of saline in as a control to see whether you inject 10 cc's of anything into a monkey's brain. That might not be good for the monkey.
Right.
They didn't find out what else was in the spine. They just said that's the transmission of the virus.
So
That's
they just
how
kind
it got
of
started.
so it started off as a hypothesis in the early 1900s, late 1800s, where they were like, okay, it's not the bacteria, so it must be something smaller than that. It must be this kind of unseen thing. We're going to call that unseen thing a virus. We don't know.
Right.
We can't see it or find it or locate it, but it must be because we don't have any other explanation, is really what they kind of came up with. Surely, though, I mean, that was about 125 years ago or 120 years ago. Surely,
But they did, Kim, they did another thing.
Yes.
they said, okay, let's investigate another hypothesis that sick people make well people, or sick animals make well animals sick. In other words, I was around Aunt Bessie. She has the flu. I went and visited her. Then I got the flu, and then Uncle Harry got the flu. And there was 20 people at a concert. They all got the flu, or they all got chickenpox. So the hypothesis was there's something transmitted from sick people to well people to make them sick.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So now tell me again whether you agree with what I'm about to say. The principle behind that is if two or more animals or people get sick with the same symptoms at the same time in the same place, that proves something was transmitted from the sick people to the well people. Is that true?
Yes, I would think so.
Okay, right. That's the principle, right?
Okay,
behind this.
Yeah.
Okay, you put 100 rats in a basement, and then somebody puts rat poison in there, and the next day 10 rats die of hemorrhage, and the next day 20 rats died of hemorrhage. Next day all 100 rats are dead from hemorrhage. Same symptoms, same place, same time. So that means that was a transmissible event.
Right. Not always would be the answer to that, in my opinion, right? But that's because that's what I've been taught my whole life. That if I'm around my husband, for example, and he's sick, and this happens to me all the time, he gets sick first because he actually goes into a work office and I don't. Comes home, he's sick. And then a few days later, I'm sick. So my assumption is, because I didn't go to his office, that he has brought something home to me and I've now caught it. It's something transmitted to me.
Right. But I think proved to you that observation doesn't even prove transmission.
Not
Same
always,
people,
right?
Not always. So if it's not always, then you're going to have to figure out some way to prove whether in this case it was transmitted or not.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
And not
So
something
the
that just
only
kind of
way
is
to do
in the
that
air.
is to do right. It could be a rat poison. It could be psychological, the nocebo. We don't know.
Okay.
So the only way to sort that out is to do science. In other words, put 100 children with chickenpox with 100 children who don't, 100 people with the flu, 100 people who don't. Spanish flu, you get 100 people with Spanish flu, and you cough into the mouth of people who are well, and you put snot up their nose, etc. So here's another fact for you to think about. There are at least 200 studies in the medical literature since 1900 that demonstrate without any doubt that illness is not transmissible. Sick people don't make well people sick, or animals. And as far as we can tell, there are no studies that show the opposite. And again, if somebody disagrees with me and says, okay, we can prove that sick people in this case make well people sick, I will recant what I just said, and I will correct myself.
So you're saying
people need to read the Rossineau study, 1918, and a book called Can You Catch a Cold? 200 studies documenting that colds and flus are not transmissible events.
really?
Period.
Do they say in these books, in these studies, do they say what is causing then? Do they go down the road
No.
of they don't?
The purpose of them is to document whether transmission of what we call colds and flus is a transmissible event. The facts are extremely clear. There is no such thing. So that's interesting, because so why are we studying virology if there's no transmission of illness from one person to the next?
Yeah.
And we already agreed that you can't tell. Now, so they did it anyway. So they took that, they say, okay, we can't transmit. We take the snot from somebody with a cold, and if we just expose that to a healthy person, they don't get a cold. They don't get the flu. They don't get chickenpox. You squirt chickenpox lesion juice on another child, they don't get chickenpox in a controlled scientific study. There is not one study that shows the opposite.
Then how did we
So
all
then
get chickenpox during our chickenpox parties?
well, so maybe that's not true, or maybe we need to talk about chickenpox. But you're going to need to send me a study showing that that is true, because I know for 100% sure that that has been studied and it's not true. There's no scientific evidence that chickenpox is a contagious, transmissible event. And again, if you disagree, I know that it's hard for people to wrap their mind around that. But that's why I started with the rat example. You can't tell whether there's something in the environment or some fear or something else that's happening. And so you have to do science, which controls 100 children who don't have chickenpox, 100 who do, put them in the room, tell them the same thing. So the independent variable is the child with chickenpox.
Yeah.
When you do that, 100% of the time, you get a negative result. Period.
100%
So
of
then
the
they
time.
went on. So 1908, they can't find. They didn't think they'd ever find this thing that was transmitting polio.
Mm-hmm.
But they did experiments with the filterable agent. In other words, they took the snot of somebody who was sick, they filtered it, exposed that to animals, children, people, pets, etc. No transmission of illness from the filterable agent. So the whole thing essentially failed. And then in the 1940s, late 1930s, they ended up inventing the so-called electron microscope. And they could take lesions, from people with chickenpox or the flu, and they saw particles, right? So they said, those are the viruses. We finally saw them. And so now we can try to take these particles and expose people to them and see if they get sick. But they were never able to isolate, purify the virus. Never. And so they ended up thinking, well, this is just cell debris, right? So this is the story of the viruses.
Yeah.
You with me here?
Yeah.
And then they got rescued in 1954 about a paper by a guy named John Enders, Nobel Prize winning paper, where they first isolated the virus, measles virus. And that changed virology and made it into what it is today. Okay?
Okay.
So let's go. So how did they isolate the virus? Because this is the key. Because again, tell me whether you disagree with this or not. You cannot tell whether something causes something else until you isolate it first and use that as the independent variable in the study. Right? If you say a hammer knocks a nail into the wall, and then you hit the nail with a toolbox, and you don't even know whether there's a hammer in there, that's not science, that's nonsense. Right?
Right.
You take the hammer out, hit the nail with the hammer, then you go like this, because that's a control. Maybe it was just your arm doing that. And then you can say the hammer makes the nail go into the wall.
Right.
Right? And isolating the hammer allows you to study what it's made of. Right?
Mm-hmm.
What if you just ground up the toolbox, never having seen a hammer in there? And you say, I think hammers are made of steel. Well, how do you know it's not the wrench or
Mm-hmm.
the screwdriver? Or I think viruses have DNA. Well, that implies that you've isolated the virus first, right?
Yeah.
So you can study what it's made of. Got it?
Yeah.
Okay. So what does the word isolation mean? It means, to me, and again, you can see if you disagree, the separation of one thing from all other things. Right?
Okay. Right. Yeah, that's what I would think
hammer.
isolation is. Yeah.
Yeah, I got the hammer and only the hammer.
Right.
I don't, if I want to isolate a pencil, I have just the pencil.
Right.
I don't grind up my pens and my magic markers, etc.
Right.
Okay, 1954, how did they isolate the measles virus? Here's how they did it. They took a child with measles, so-called measles, who was sick, right? Child
Mm-hmm.
was sick. They took some snot, they put it through a filter paper to get the cells and the bacteria out. So that, and they didn't look for a virus, right? They just got pure, like the liquid part of the snot. They put that on growing tissue of monkey kidney cells that are specially bred to break down. They added kidney toxic antibiotics. They added calf serum, fetal bovine serum, and horse serum. And they added some other chemicals. And 3 days later, the monkey kidney cells just broke down, they died. And they said that meant they isolated the virus. What do you think about that?
Right. So that's clearly not isolating the virus. I mean, when I'm thinking of isolating a virus, I want to see whatever a virus would look like under a microscope, I guess. I mean, or whatever device you would need in order for me to be able to see it. I would want to actually truly see just the particle that is called the virus.
Right. And that's never been done.
That's never been done.
Never been done. That what I described, taking unpurified material from a sick person, putting that on a culture of kidney cells or sometimes other cells, adding antibiotics, adding fetal bovine serum, adding other chemicals, and seeing whether the tissue breaks down since 1954, and every virology experiment since is called the isolation of the virus, SARS-CoV-2, HIV, smallpox, herpes, etc. And then, so the virus has never been isolated because that is what the definition, according to a virologist, is.
Yeah.
If you say the common sense thing that you just said, why don't you take somebody's snot and pick out the particles, show me pure particles under the electron microscope, and then we can study them, see what it's made of, see what it does. They will tell you that can't be done. That has never been done. 220 institutions, the CDC, the NIH, charity in France, have been asked, show us a paper where you took the fluids of a sick person and purified out this particle called HIV or SARS-CoV-2, and they all say you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's never been done. So these part of this breakdown of the tissue, by the way, for all your listeners, we did an experiment where we did the same thing. In fact, Enders did it. We took the kidney cells, put the antibiotics in, put the fetal bovine serum in, put the same chemicals, no snot from anybody who's sick. 3 days later, 100% of the kidney cells broke down, proving there was a virus, but there was nothing from anybody with the virus anywhere near the experiment, actually proving that the whole thing is a pseudo-scientific fraud.
Okay, so so then answer this for me. There's allegedly, there's some modern techniques for virus isolation. The three being,
No.
You don't think that so let me tell you what these three are. Cell culture, so viruses grown in specific cell lines that support the replication. There's then electron microscopy, which allows visualization of virus particles, like cryo-electron microscopy, providing detailed images of virus structures. And then there's molecular techniques like polymorph chain reaction, so PCRs, next generation sequencing that help detect the viral genetic material directly from clinical samples. What about those three?
So first of all, the second two are not called isolation. Whoever told you they were called isolation was fooling you,
Mm-hmm.
because they thought you wouldn't know what they were talking about.
Well, I don't.
The isolation of the virus is a cell culture.
Okay.
That's what I just described. that is how every single virologist on earth will say you isolate a virus. You take unpurified material, put it on a cell culture, the cell culture breaks down. That is called the isolate of the isolation of the virus. That has been disproven. We took the ruler out and we showed that that's not the reason the cells are breaking down.
Okay.
There is no virus. Now, the next thing, they take pictures of the broken down tissue with cryo electron microscopy or whatever. And they say, see, these particles are the broken down came from the replication of the virus in the tissue. But it is clearly in the medical literature that you cannot distinguish between the breakdown of those tissues and any virus. 100%. And anybody who disagrees, I have what I call my pumpkin challenge test, because I have a little cat named Pumpkin and he knows how to say right or yes or no. Right hand is right paw is yes, left is no. And I showed him 5 pictures of broken down kidney cells before 2000, right? Just kidney biopsies, people with kidney cancer, and SARS-CoV-2, right? So some of them were kidney cancer and some of them were SARS-CoV-2. They had identical looking particles, and Pumpkin got 6 out of 10 correct because he just guesses.
Yeah, right.
And no virologist could do better, because there is no way to distinguish the breakdown of the tissue from a so-called virus. No way. And they know that. That's why they say that you cannot tell from an electron microscope picture. You first have to isolate it. And then you have to, once you isolate it, then you can study it and see what it does.
Yeah. So you're
now,
saying they don't even know.
The DNA or RNA, let me just say that. If you haven't isolated, they say you can't isolate it, Tom, because you can't separate it from the tissue, right?
Okay.
The virus has to live in the cells. Now, the first thing then I ask them is, so how does it go from one person to another? In the cell?
Right.
No, it gets out of the cell and goes to the next person. Wait a minute, you just told me it can't get out of the cell and it'll die. Well, yeah, but it can get out for a little while. So why don't you catch it then and find it then?
Yeah.
Well, because there's not enough. They say there's 100 million in a sneeze. So you mean you can't find one that you could find outside of the cell? No. So, but if it's true that they've never been able to separate the cell, right, the kidney cells, from the virus, and then you just test the DNA or the RNA in the brew, how do you know whether it's coming from the virus or the kidney cells?
Yeah.
You know what the answer is? You don't.
Yeah.
So you make up a fake way of stitching together the little pieces, because here's another fact. In no sequencing procedure have they ever found the entire, quote, genome of a virus. Not once. They take little pieces of unknown origin, put them in a computer. The computer gives them a million different options. They choose the one that they think is right. It never quite matches the other one, so it's a variant, and they just keep that bogus story going. There has never been an experiment with a virus, because in order to have an experiment with a virus, you have to prove this is a pure sample of a virus. There's never been an experiment with a unicorn, because nobody has ever isolated and shown us a unicorn that we can find out what the toenails of a unicorn look like.
Right.
Until you do that, you don't know if it has RNA, DNA, or bat shit in it.
Right.
Because until you isolate it and purify it, you don't know anything.
Okay.
That's called common sense.
Sure. So they categorize a whole variety, a whole slew of illnesses as viruses. And they say these are all viruses. which make a simpleton like me believe that they all share certain characteristics, like bacteria. So bacteria shares certain characteristics with other bacteria. So then viruses would need to share certain characteristics with other viruses. That would be my non-scientific, somebody who's not a scientist, that would be my thinking, is that that's what they're trying to tell me, is that this virus, so a virus is something separate. And you're saying they've never been able to study a virus, like they don't know what it looks like at all. They've never isolated,
because
so they
it
have no
doesn't
clue.
exist. Because the way
Well,
they
you don't know it doesn't
isolate
exist. It might exist, right? I mean, it's just that you've never been able
might
to
exist.
isolate it.
There's no evidence. There's no scientific evidence that meets the requirements of common sense, logic, or rational thinking that shows that any such particle that meets the definition of a virus has been shown to exist. So anything they say about it, that it has this or causes this, is pure, like reification fallacy. In other words, so I know why the buildings in the Ukraine are being blown up. It's invisible unicorns. Well, how do you know that? Well, Kim, the buildings are being blown up. It's got to be something.
Right.
Well, can you show it to us? No, Kim, they're invisible. That's why, and not only that, they fly backwards and around the curves. That's why they can go to the next building.
Yeah.
Well, how do you know that if you've never seen them? So you just keep making up stories. And then you make up an immune system that covers up the story of why people get sick and other people don't. Yeah. There's no immune system. It's just making up one story after another.
Right.
And that's called science.
Okay. I mean, I can understand if it's true, which I'll have to just believe you because I'm not a scientist, like most people.
Don't believe me. Go find a study that shows a purified virus.
How do they do PCR testing then?
What?
How do they do PCR testing if they haven't been able to sequence a virus to know what they're looking for in these particular PCR tests?
So let's go through what the requirements of a PCR test would be, right?
Yeah.
So that's how you answer that. First of all, you're talking about an alleged piece of something, like the toenail of a unicorn.
Okay.
Now, in order to say that that piece came from a unicorn, in my world, you first have to have a unicorn and find out that the toenail came from a unicorn.
Sure.
So that's never been done because they have no example of an isolated purified virus that has a RNA sequence that has a piece of the RNA sequence. So they can't tell you that that came from a virus. Right?
Right.
So the test is meaningless from the get-go. And the other rule of this is, how do you know this toenail didn't come from some other animal? Right? You'd have to know that in order for it to be a test. Well, they tell you that they've never separated the virus from the cell or the tissue or your lungs. So how do you know that that piece of RNA or DNA that you're testing for didn't come from your lungs? If you've never separated the two, then you can't know that, right? So the test is meaningless. So here's the answer. Why do you get some people positive and some people negative? First of all, the correct answer is we don't really know, except it can't possibly because one has a virus and the other doesn't, because we've never shown that sequence came from a virus, because we've never isolated the virus. And we have shown absolutely definitively that every sequence they're testing for is part of the human sequences. In other words, what they're testing for is the breaking down of your lungs. So here's a guess as to what the test is. If your lungs are breaking down because you're afraid, or you don't eat good food, or you suck on too many EMFs, or a whole lot of other reasons, then your lungs break down to sort of help get rid of the bad stuff. And those are more likely to show up on a PCR test because there's more sequences they can look at. And so all it's testing is whether the person is breaking down or not. Now that's a guess because they won't study it properly to be able to actually verify if that's true.
Yeah.
But that's my strong hunch.
How have they been able
It
to
has nothing to
cure?
do with the virus.
How have they been able to cure certain viruses then, like hepatitis C, for example? How are they
They
able to
can't
cure?
they haven't cured anything with any so-called antivirals. In fact, when you look at what an antiviral medicine supposedly does, whether a natural one or a pharmaceutical one, the way they find those out, so again, the way they prove the existence of a virus, they take like the liver tissue of somebody with hep, they say has hep C. They put that on a cell culture, the cell culture breaks down, right? That's how they prove there's a virus.
Sure.
So you can take some chemical like quercetin and put that in the cell culture, and it protects the tissues from breaking down, right? A little bit. And they say that's an antiviral. That's how they say it. You put some vitamin C in there, it protects the tissue from breaking down as quickly. They say that's an antiviral. That's nonsense, pure nonsense. So you give people certain things, they're breaking down. Why are they breaking down? Nobody has ever isolated a hep C virus. Nobody, if you haven't isolated it, you can't possibly know what it's made of.
Yeah.
You can't possibly do an experiment with it and expose somebody else to it and show that they get sick. So why do people get sick with liver problems? Number one, they drink. Number two, they get blood transfusions. Number three, they take all kinds of synthetic medicines, antibiotics. They live with fear and afraid of the government, which is actually not a bad thing, and a whole lot of other things that make them sick. And their tissue breaks down, and they call that a virus. And then they give them something, and it stops the tissue from breaking down temporarily. But you see, the biggest psyop of all in this is they got us convinced that when your body is doing things like getting rid of snot or coughing, that's a disease. Now, here's how to disprove that. If you get a splinter in your finger, next thing that happens is you get pus, right? Is the pus a disease, or is that the therapy for the splinter?
Right. That's the therapy,
It's
obviously.
The therapy
right.
for the splinter.
Yeah.
So you breathe in debris like chemtrail shit and all the rest of this stuff, and then you cough.
Yeah.
And then they say, you've got a disease called coughing disease bronchitis. You don't have a disease called coughing disease. Your body is doing what any reasonable body would do, which is cough up toxic debris. And your brilliant doctor thinks you have a disease and keeps you from coughing, and then the debris builds up, and then you get lung cancer.
Okay. All right. So what are the implications of this? So I can totally believe that they've never isolated a virus, that they don't really, that they're kind of just guessing, and they're like, oh, it's a virus that must cause this because we can't see it, we can't isolate it. So it's a virus, and they're kind of categorizing a variety of things as viruses without having fully, they haven't been able to grasp it. That makes some sense, just anecdotally, those of us that are just not scientists living in life, when PCR testing, for example, is obviously not reliable. Sometimes you test positive, sometimes you test negative. Then they sit there and they tell us, well, whatever it is, they sit there and they tell us, oh, well, it's not exact. Yeah, you could get false negatives, you could get false positives, right? You could get, so we just kind of say, oh, okay, I guess they're not always accurate. There's also the fact that antiviral drugs, do they work? I don't know if I've ever taken an antiviral that I feel like when they said, oh, like if I go to the doctor and I'm sick and they say, well, it's not bacterial, so it must be viral. And then, well, what do I do? Well, nothing we can really do about viral. Go sleep and drink some water. They haven't been able to give us truly effective medications for viruses like they have been able to for bacteria. Now, we could, you could dispute that. We can get into bacteria, but from just
it's hard to give anti-exploding unicorn medicine.
Right. So I'm saying that from just like a experience, the rest of us that are not doctors, the rest of us that are not scientists, our experiences are viruses are difficult. What they basically told us is we can kind of test for them or we can't. We can kind of treat them or we can't. So that right there makes sense that they don't really know what they're doing or what they're talking about when it comes to this thing that they're calling a virus. So I could buy, just from that experience alone, I could buy that they don't really truly know. But that to me is how science has been from the beginning of time. They didn't know what was causing things to fall, like gravity or whatever. Science has been discovery, and as we're not born with this implicit knowledge. We have to discover it, and science is forever evolving. There's more discoveries being made. One day, maybe we'd be able to do time travel. We haven't been able to discover it yet. But just because we haven't been able to discover it doesn't mean it doesn't really exist. And even though we haven't discovered it and we're kind of lumping it into this kind of crude category because we don't really fully understand it, that doesn't mean something's not there. It just means that they need to do the science needs to advance.
This is not correct, Kim. I'm sorry to interrupt. They have a very specific claim on how they have proven these viruses exist. That claim has been falsified. Period. If there's only two reasons why anybody these days believes there are viruses. Well, three reasons. One, you couldn't care less, in which case you have no opinion on the matter.
Right.
Number two, you are ignorant of the subject.
Which most of us are.
Number three, you have nefarious intentions.
But so you're saying that they are asserting this. So just so that I'm totally clear, you're saying they are asserting without a shadow of a doubt that viruses exist. They're not saying, well,
Absolutely.
This is our best guess.
No, they've locked the whole world down. They give you injection after injection.
Right.
They cannot prove there is even a measles virus or a smallpox virus or an HIV virus. They give people medicines. They change your life. They lock the world down. This is one of the biggest positive claims, assertions ever.
Yeah. Well, I understand
and it's
that.
Wrong.
I understand.
It's falsified.
Right. I understand.
It's not a straight line, period.
Sure. And I understand that the implicate of what they've done to us in particular recently with COVID and what they intend to do with these future disease X's and these future viruses that they think that, to me, those are two separate things, though. It's to allow the tyranny of the government over anything, even if they have isolated it. I mean, it doesn't matter to me.
They haven't isolated.
But even if they did, I don't care if they did or didn't. Even if they had the tyranny,
because that ends the story.
No, it doesn't, because they could say, well, we have now, Tom. So guess what? Now you need to lock down and change your whole life. And we finally were able to prove it after all. We got this special microscope.
Let me see the study and I can show you why it's bogus.
But even then, my point is the tyranny of the government is separate on whether or not this exists or doesn't exist, because I don't want the tyranny of the government whether something exists or doesn't. That shouldn't have the tyranny is one thing. Now what they used for this particular tyranny was they said, we've got a virus we're trying to protect grandma from. We don't want, to kill off people. Millions of people will die. So therefore, we're going to go through all of these various measures and ruin your lives. They use that as an excuse. I understand then the point from there. I do understand wanting to then say, you guys have never even been able to prove that this virus exists. And I think that's a good point, a good argument against their tyranny, but it's not the only argument against their tyranny. It can't be, because, like I said, some genius could come along with the special device and they say, finally, I did it. Now what, guys? Now you're going to have to accept our tyranny. I'm not going to accept it no matter what. So I understand that they use it as an excuse on us. They'll use it as a future excuse on us. That to me is separate. The issue of the science, something is surely causing me, something caused me to get chickenpox. Something caused me to get the measles. I had both in my life. I also had the mumps. I never, got those vaccines, but they didn't.
So what's the definition of chickenpox?
Well, obviously I've got the scars, right? It's the bumps, the sores that show up all over a little kid's body or even an adult's body, and they get sick and they get all these bumps everywhere. And we don't see that anymore.
How do you distinguish chickenpox from monkeypox, from smallpox, from measles, from fifth disease, from erythema,
I would imagine that they have
erosionola.
some characteristics. I mean, I got both chickenpox and measles and mumps as a kid, and I don't. They must have known the difference between measles and chicken. I got measles when I was 3. I got
Who's
chickenpox
they?
when I was 5. Well, the doctors, they must have been able to like look at the size of the sores
But
and say,
it's
well,
been
this.
proven that they cannot tell the difference between any of these so-called childhood diseases.
Well,
Proven.
what's the difference between the flu and AIDS then at that point? I mean, surely I'm
So
not getting AIDS every year. I might get the flu every year, but I'm not getting HIV.
right, there's different levels of what your body is trying to accomplish and going through depending on your situation. The point is that, and this is very important because the way they make epidemics, it's very clear. They take a bunch of different diseases like with polio. So they have Guillain-Barré and they have MS and they have acute flaccid paralysis, and they lump them all into polio.
Yeah.
And then when they get a vaccine, they say, oh, polio is gone. They change the definition. Now you have MS, acute flaccid paralysis, Guillain-Barré, and 10 other things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they did with COVID. So it used to be you have the flu and you have bronchitis and you got rashes and you got this. All those got lumped into the diagnostic category of COVID, which nobody can tell you what the actual definition of COVID is. Nobody, because it's the same as all the other ones. And then when they roll out the vaccine or something, they split them. And now everybody's got the flu and they got monkeypox and they got measles, etc. And that's how they game the system.
Right. And I understand that. I
My
understand
point here is if we live in a scientifically illiterate world, which
Yeah.
we do, including and especially the doctors and the scientists, we are going to be subject to one tyranny after another because we don't get it.
Yeah. I understand that. I believe that.
Something to game us,
Sure.
and bamboozle us, and tyrannize us, and that is exactly
Right. If we're
what's
ignorant, surely, I mean that, and there is obviously value in this. So I'm not saying we should just remain ignorant and just be like, well, they said it's a virus or whatever, and they just don't. Yeah, so they haven't been able to really isolate it, whatever. I'm not advocating for that. Obviously, the more knowledge we have and the less ignorant we are, they won't be able to push certain things on us. You know, if we're ignorant, they can, and we just will believe them because we're ignorant. But if we're not ignorant, then we could say that's not going to work, which many of us did during the pandemic about a variety of measures that they wanted to enact. It was just many of us looked at some of those measures and thought, no, that logically is not going to work. So you're going to impose this, it's not going to work. So there's
one other fact, if I can interrupt,
Yeah.
one other factor here. That once you as a listener, if there's one thing you can do to improve your life and your health and your overall sense of well-being, it's to cure yourself of the fear of germs and these invisible boogeymen making you sick. Once you realize that amongst a whole lot of other things, is just a psychological ploy to keep you afraid and subservient and dominated by people who don't have your best interest, there will be a breath of fresh air in your soul and in your life that you have never experienced before. You will realize the world is a different place than they had made it out for us.
Yeah.
They have this place of fear and domination, and that's not how it works.
Well, many of us don't live like that. I mean, I don't Purell my hands all the time or care. I don't do antibacterials in general, actually, because I think they're unhealthy. But that's, there are people like myself that are not living in fear. We're not afraid of germs. We're not afraid of catching things. We're not living that way. So and there are certainly a lot of people who do live that way, and it would be very liberating if they didn't, I'm sure, for themselves. But these diseases are not psychological. Are you saying that they're psychological, that measles is psychological, that chickenpox is psychological, that getting the flu is psychological?
I didn't say that at all.
No, that's what I'm asking you. Are you saying that?
What happens with disease, as best we can say, first of all all symptoms, including cancer and Alzheimer's and everything that we have as so-called diseases, are your body's attempt to heal. You get a splinter in your finger, you make pus to get the splinter out. You get, toxic stuff and emotional stuff and fear and trauma, and breathe in Paris green arsenic from the wallpaper, and then you get an eruption through your skin. And we have called those, that eruption through your skin is the therapy part. The breathing in the arsenic, that's the disease part.
Sure.
And we have confused those two things. So if it's just like the example I use, if you have a house and you put a whole bunch of toxic garbage in your foyer, most people put it in bags, and they put it in the garage. And if you put a whole bunch of toxic debris in your house called your body, you will eventually, unless you can get it out through these so-called diseases like chickenpox and measles and the flu and bronchitis, that's what you first try to do. If that is thwarted by giving you injections and antibiotics and all the rest of it, then you put it in bags in certain places of your body. We call those cancer. That is not a disease. That's your body putting it in a place. And then you can either keep putting more, if you get more and more garbage, you put it in more and more places in your house, in your spare bedroom, and then the kitchen, and then the living room, and then you move out of the house. That's what you do with your body. You put more and more toxic debris in, more and more emotional toxicity, thinking toxicity, food toxicity, environmental toxicity. We have a number of ways of doing that. We put it in bags. We call that cancer erroneously. We try to kill the cancer by giving you more toxic debris. It doesn't work. I wrote a whole book about that. We have to stop doing this and playing the victim. That's what this gets to. We have a medical system based on people playing the victim. You didn't do anything. A virus got you. It's your genes. It's bad luck. You didn't do anything. It's not the stuff we spray in the air. It's not how you eat. It's not what you think. It's not your emotional toxin. You got nothing to do with it. And if you don't believe that, we're going to excommunicate your sorry ass from the Church of Medicine. And that is the disease right there.
Well, I do think it's important. I think that this discussion is important. I think that people finding out, I think what's happened, especially since COVID, is that many of us are more skeptical and more open to these types of ideas. I think prior to COVID, many of us would, there's a guy, this doctor, and he says that viruses don't exist, and people would just say, oh my gosh, what a quack, right? But since COVID and since all of the lies, I think so many more millions of people have been awakened to maybe they're just lying to us about what else have they told me that I just believed because they told me that? And so I think now we're
There's a guy
open.
named William Casey, William Casey, former CIA director. He said, quoting, once our disinformation campaign is finished, everything, and I emphasize the word everything the American public believes will be false.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah.
Right from the horse's mouth.
Right. And there's certainly a huge motivation by the pharmaceutical industry. And now, of course, the tyranny of the government when they see that they can use this as a method of control. There is obviously a lot of money to be made in just pumping us full of vaccines, right? Saying from childbirth, pumping babies full of vaccines and saying, well, because we want to prevent this virus and this virus and this virus. And so it is extremely important for us to know the truth on why we're pumping ourselves full of these random medications.
Here's what I have homework for everybody listening. And say, okay, this Cowan guy, he's this moron, he's an idiot. So go tomorrow or next time you have, and go to your family doctor, right? He's highly trained. I went to medical school, highly trained guy, pediatrician, internist, family doctor, and say, hey, bud, how does a virologist prove the existence of a virus and show that it causes disease? They won't know. They won't know. They won't know the answer to that question. Now think about that. It's like going to a mechanic saying my car is going. I think it's the brakes. He says, "What are brakes?"
Right. Have you talked to virologists who agree with you, who say, yeah, my field is just, I went into virology, got in there and realized, wow, we really don't know anything?
I know a few,
Okay.
but the rest of them aren't talking.
Yeah.
And the reason is because the so-called freedom community has run interference for them. And so they're keeping people like me and Mark and Andy and the rest of us at bay. They're running interference for the virologists.
Mm-hmm.
If we can get to the virologists, this story is over because they know that it's bogus. They know it. They know we've proven this cell culture is bogus. Pumpkin proved that the electron microscopy is bogus. We have literally, even this lab leak bullshit. We have proven that they made that up from the start. They actually, in their fake genome, inserted a piece from the fake HIV and disseminated that through the world, knowing that people would look at that and say, oh my God, they engineered HIV virus into SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah.
Nothing like that is the case. There is no lab engineered gain of function, all that nonsense that you hear about. That's just fear porn. So they did that deliberately because the gig with the government is you always have to give two stories, the real story and then the dissenter story. So the real story is a scary virus. The gotcha story is the lab leak story. So that's what the Kennedys and the Rand Pauls and all they're selling, the fake lab leak story.
But surely
it's just the other side of the narrative.
Right, but something is making us sick. I mean, you must, right?
So who's your real parents?
Yeah, something is making us sick. So isn't it worth finding out what the root cause of HIV or the root cause of measles or the root cause of the flu?
We already know that. The root cause of AIDS, there is no HIV. First of all, it's not a new disease. They had that with transplantation drugs. So if you basically poison somebody, socially isolate them, make them take poppers and amyl nitrate 20 times a day. I mean, how long do you think you would last if you had 100 sex partners, anal sex in a month, taking amyl nitrates, lots of antibiotics, socially isolated, not eating, and drinking like a fish? Like, I don't think I'd last a month. That is no way to live, and that's what they were doing. And so instead of that, it's a virus? I mean, you got to be kidding. A virus that we can't even find?
What if somebody is diagnosed with AIDS and they don't, I mean, it almost sounds like you're just saying it's in your mind and your lifestyle.
I did not say it's in your mind.
Well, but that's what it sounds like.
Poppers, anal sex.
Okay, so you're saying it's lifestyle.
Antibiotics.
Right, it's lifestyle. So then what if a person, I mean, surely not everybody who has AIDS lived that lifestyle. I mean, there's plenty of people who got it, children, for example, who were born with it from their mother's womb, or women who get it from their male partners.
They're born with HIV based on a bogus test, and they were given a drug called AZT, which failed as a cancer drug because it was too poisonous, and that killed them. So you have to also realize that it's somehow not enough for the medical profession to just misdiagnose people. They also have to do them in. So they give them remdesivir, they give them, breathing machines,
right.
They give them vaccines, they give them AZT, they give them morphine, they give them all kind of stuff In the Spanish flu, they sprayed them with all kind of toxic chemicals. They gave them 30 aspirin every day to make, and then they hemorrhaged. So it's not enough to just misdiagnose and misinterpret it. They actually then try to start doing you away
Yeah.
for God knows what reason. I don't know why they're doing it, but that's what happens.
Right, but there are groups of people out there who don't. They choose, they get these diagnoses and then they say, it's not in my belief system, or, I've just decided I'm not going to do anything to treat this. I mean, what happens? So that's like the control group from what you're talking about. I mean, they're the people that get pumped full of all the meds. I get it that the medical community want to throw into us, but then there's those others, the defiant people that say, I'm not going to do anything for this. What happens to them? I mean, it seems like many of them still die, or they still.
Every situation is an individual case. There is no group diagnosis. That's one of the fallacies of medicine. So if you're working with somebody with so-called AIDS, you hear their story. And everybody has a story of what they're doing and what they believe and what they think and what they're eating and what toxic stuff is in their house. And the whole like new biology clinic that we're doing is we go through that, we remediate what is wrong in the person's life. And if you can do that, they go on and get better. So of course there are people who, they still have the belief that HIV causes AIDS. They still do all kinds of things. You can't just in the abstract say, well, there's all these people. That doesn't mean anything. You have to go through case by case. What is happening with this person? That is the way of medicine. That's the medicine of the future, and that's what we're trying to bring about in our clinic and in our work. And we've got more and more doctors who are saying, I am sick of this nonsense, these diagnostic categories that don't mean anything. You take it, the AIDS thing, you do an HIV test. There are, according to the CDC, 70 different conditions that are positive for an HIV test.
Yeah.
How is that possible? And a guy named Hans Gelderblum did a study. So he takes T lymphocyte of a person with AIDS, right? So that's where the HIV is. He grinds it up, says there's 28 proteins in there. So those are the HIV proteins, some of them. Then he does a T lymphocyte from a normal person, same 28 proteins, proving there's no HIV proteins, meaning there's no HIV. Proving, just like take a ruler, straight line, done.
Yeah.
There's no case to be made. If you believe that, that's part of your illness.
Right. Well, I mean, look, history, probably you're right. I mean, I would have to do my research on this. I'm glad we had this conversation, and I know anybody watching would have to do their research on this as well. But you're probably right. I mean, history shows you're probably right. And the reason is because science has never, I mean, when we look back at science from 100 years ago or 200 years ago, medicine and science, what do we still, I mean, are we bloodletting anymore? Are we doing lobotomies? I mean, there's so much that we no longer do that was once done, that was considered the tried and true method at the time. And I don't know if there's a single thing that we still do today that was done 100 or 200 or 1,000 years ago in the world of medicine and in science. Everything has shifted. I think it's highly believable, highly probable.
We still do acupuncture. We still do herbs.
Sure, there's a lot of stuff. We
still tell people to fast. We still have people eat good diets. We still have people go out in the sunshine. We still have people ground themselves to the earth. We still have people find out what's eating them and the traumas in their life. We still have people try to find a community of people that they can help and love and respect and form a good life. We do a lot of the same things.
We do a lot of the natural same things,
we
for
do
sure.
chemical lobotomies.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean, is that we've constantly shifted when it comes to modern medicine, what would be considered modern medicine in each era. That has shifted. I mean, everything you're mentioning, the more natural stuff, that's definitely always been there. But the scientific, the modern science stuff has always shifted. And I think it's highly probable that in 200 years, they'll look back at our society today and they'll be like, can you believe they did this, this, and this, and this? And it's stuff that we today think is absolute science and medicine, and anybody who doesn't believe that is a quack. I mean, the reality is, the probability is that everything that we think we know today will not be in 200 years from now. They'll look at us and think that we were primitive in our thinking and in our knowledge. So it is highly likely that you're right, more than you're not right. Would be my assertion on that, just by looking at history. But I think that this. Go ahead.
Let me just say another thing. This whole thing changed in the early part of the 1900s, and it was summarized by a quote from a guy named Albert Einstein, who I'm sure you've heard of. Supposedly the smartest guy who ever lived, right? Time man of the century. And I'm paraphrasing here, but this is the essence of the problem in the last 100 years. He said, science should no longer be based on observation and experimental data. It should be based on free inventions of the mind. Or in other words, this is Tom Cowan paraphrasing or analyzing that. In other words, make shit up. And so we did. Go forth, young men and women, and make shit up. And so, like, but everybody who's exposed to a virus or a sick person gets sick. So then you falsify it, right? Right. Doesn't happen. Then you have to make up another story to keep that first one going.
Sure.
Well, that's because these people have a good immune system. And so it's one making shit up after another.
Right.
And that's what happened. And that's we're in the throes of that way of thinking from the dean of science. That's what Einstein said. That's what we do. And it's got to stop.
Very interesting. What book should people read of yours to kind of get more information on this? Would that be The Contagion Myth?
I mean, yeah, I wrote a simpler one called Breaking the Spell.
Breaking the Spell.
Little booklet they can get from our website.
Okay.
They should look at the Baileys, Mark and Sam Bailey, Andy Kaufman, Mike Stone. There's so many experiments and debunking of their science that they did. But I'm telling you, everybody, go to your doctor tomorrow and say, how does a virologist prove there's a virus, show it caused diseases? Mm-hmm. You will be astonished because they have no clue.
Interesting. Dr. Tom Cowan, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really great conversation, and one that, like I said, many of my viewers have been wanting me to have for a while, is to really talk about whether or not viruses even exist. And so grateful that you've had this conversation. I'm not convinced either way because I admit ignorance on this. So I'm open to all ideas. I've always been open to all ideas. And like I said, I do think that history will probably, most likely, in 200 years or 300 years, they'll look back and they'll be like, wow, those guys were all idiots. And that's what they believed. And that's not at all true. So it's more likely than not, I think, that you're right on this. But I do encourage people to do their own research, of course, like I always do. But we'll put the links down below to your website so that they can look more into this and kind of research it for themselves. But it certainly, they are trying to pump us full of a lot of medications and vaccines, and they're certainly trying to, continue to modify our lives like they did through the pandemic, or not even modify, but like completely hinder and disrupt and ruin lives. So it is, I think, really important to know the science behind what it is they're trying to assert and why we need to do certain things based on their science, right? I mean, I think that's like the crux of why this is super important, in my opinion. But I appreciate you.
Yeah, except there is no science.
Right, and that's that. Right, then that would be the point.
And if you're not convinced, then it actually, in an honest way, it becomes your responsibility to show, okay, this Cowan guy, he says they've never isolated a virus. So just like we've asked the virologist, give us a definition of isolation, show us a paper that did it.
Yeah, okay.
I'll change my tune. You know how many times we've gotten that in 4 years? Zilch.
Dr. Tom Cowan, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Okay, Kim, good to see you.
All right, guys. Well, that was a very interesting conversation. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on it. Email me, kim@kimiversen.com, especially those of you who had maybe not heard of this theory before that, or this hypothesis, or I'm sure I'm not framing that correctly, but those have never heard this before of there are no viruses. I would like to hear from you. Were you convinced? Have you maybe done some more research on this? What are your thoughts? Email me, kim@kimiversen.com. All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. We'll be back with another great show tomorrow, same time, same place, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Until then, guys, have a great night. Bye-bye.